Hey there, future diplomats and policymakers. If you're listening to this, I know you're probably working hard to crack the UPSC, and I know for those of you with international relations as your optional.
Well, let's just say you've picked a field that's fascinating, but man, it's challenging. There's just so much to cover.
It's true, the IR syllabus is vast and demanding, but it's also incredibly rewarding, and understanding the thinkers who shape the field is going to be key to acing that exam.
Exactly. And that's why today we're doing a deep dive into the work of John Stuart Mill. Now, before you think, oh, another dead philosopher, let me assure you, Mill's ideas are anything but irrelevant. We're talking about concepts that are debated in international relations even today, from human rights to the very nature of liberty itself.
You'll be surprised how often you encounter Mill's ideas in contemporary discussions, whether it's about intervention in another country's affairs or the balance between individual rights and national security. So, to help you navigate this complex terrain, we're going to unpack some of Mill's core ideas, particularly his evolving views on liberty and how they connect to the bigger picture of international relations. Trust me, by the end of this deep dive, you'll have the knowledge to impress even the toughest UPSC examiner.
We'll delve into the nuances of his thought, highlighting the key takeaways that are relevant to your exam preparation.
Okay, so let's start by getting to know the man himself. Mill's life story is pretty remarkable. He had this incredibly intense education, practically force-fed knowledge by his father, James Mill, who was a major figure in the Scottish Enlightenment.
Imagine learning Greek at age 4 and Latin at 8. John Stuart was publishing work on economics before most people even finish high school. It was a demanding upbringing, to say the least.
It makes you wonder if that contributed to the mental crisis he had in his 20s. It's fascinating, though, how he turned to romantic poetry for solace, and how that ended up shaping his later political ideas. You wouldn't think poetry and politics go hand in hand.
It's a crucial point, actually. Mill's encounter with Romanticism exposed him to the power of emotions, imagination, and individual expression. Things that his rigorous, logic-driven upbringing had somewhat neglected.
So it broadened his perspective beyond just pure logic and reason.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It led him to question the rigid framework of Bentham's utilitarianism, which his father had championed. Utilitarianism, as you might recall, is all about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's Bentham's famous line.
Reichry rings a bell from my UPSC prep days.
Well, Mill came to argue that there's a difference between simply being satisfied, like as he put it, a pig satisfied, and experiencing true happiness.
So it's not just about maximizing any kind of pleasure.
Not quite. Mill believed that some pleasures are inherently more valuable than others. He famously said, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." He argued that intellectual and moral pursuits lead to higher, more fulfilling forms of happiness.
That's a great quote. Now, for our UPSC aspirants out there, how does this critique of utilitarianism, this idea of higher pursuits, connect to international relations?
That's where it gets really interesting. If we apply this to the international stage, it challenges the idea that states should simply pursue their own narrow self-interest, defined solely in terms of power or wealth. If individuals are capable of striving for something more than basic satisfaction, then perhaps states should too.
So what would a higher pursuit look like for a nation? What should states be aiming for, according to Mill?
That's a question that Mill grappled with throughout his work. He believed that states like individuals should strive for a form of well-being that fosters individual development, justice, and even moral progress. This is reflected in modern debates about human rights, global development, and international cooperation. This idea of states striving for a higher form of well-being, it connects directly to one of Mill's most influential concepts, his notion of liberty.
Right. And then when we talk about Mill and liberty, we can't ignore the harm principle. This is a cornerstone of liberal thought, and it comes up constantly in international relations. Essentially, it says you can't restrict someone's freedom unless they're harming others.
That's the gist of it. Mill argued that the only legitimate reason to limit individual liberty is to prevent harm to others. But as you can imagine, applying this principle in the real world isn't always straightforward. What exactly constitutes harm? Where do we draw the line between actions that primarily affects the individual versus those that impact others?
Those are tricky questions. And they're precisely the kinds of dilemmas that policymakers and international organizations face all the time. Think about humanitarian intervention, for example. When is it justified to intervene in another country's affairs to prevent harm to its citizens? What about economic sanctions? They might harm a population in the short term, but the goal is to pressure a government into changing its behavior. Mill's ideas provide a framework for grappling with these complex issues.
Absolutely. He made this important distinction between self-regarding actions, which mainly concern the individual, and other regarding actions which directly impact others. This distinction is still hotly debated in political philosophy and international law. It's not always easy to determine where one ends and the other begins.
And it's interesting how this connects to Mill's concern about the tyranny of the majority.
Right.
Right? It's not just about formal laws restricting individual freedom. Even without laws, social pressure and the fear of being ostracized can be incredibly powerful.
Precisely, Mill recognized that even in a democracy, the majority could impose its will on the minority, stifling individuality and dissenting opinions.
This has huge implications for international relations, too. Think about how countries are often pressured to conform to international norms, even if those norms aren't codified in treaties. The fear of being isolated on the world stage can be a strong motivator.
Now, what's fascinating about Mill's view of liberty is that it wasn't just about being left alone, about freedom from interference. He also emphasized the importance of having the opportunity and the capacity to develop oneself, to think critically, and to make meaningful choices. This is what we might call positive liberty.
So it's not enough to just remove barriers. You also need to empower people to make use of their freedom.
Exactly. For Mill, true freedom is about more than just the absence of constraints. It's about having the ability to shape your own life and participate fully in society.
And this ties back to his idea of higher pleasures, doesn't it? It's not just about being free from external constraints, but also about being free to pursue those higher forms of happiness that come from self-development and active citizenship.
You're spot on. He saw education as absolutely crucial for fostering this kind of positive liberty.
It's interesting how Mill's support for women's suffrage fits into this. He wasn't just advocating for political equality. He saw it as essential for women's self-development and for a just society.
Absolutely. He believed that denying women access to education, to the public sphere, and to political participation ultimately harmed not only women themselves, but also society as a whole.
And this has clear resonance with contemporary global movements for women's rights, access to education, and economic empowerment. These are all issues that Mill grappled with over a century ago.
Now it's important to acknowledge that no thinker is without their critics. Even Mill's most ardent supporters recognize that his work raises some complex questions.
What are some of the criticisms leveled at Mill's ideas? What kinds of questions might a UPSC examiner throw your way about his work?
One common criticism is that the distinction between the individual and society, between self-regarding and other-regarding actions, isn't always so clear-cut in practice. Can we really separate them so neatly? Another question is whether liberty can truly be absolute. Are there any circumstances where individual freedom should be curtailed, even if it doesn't directly harm others? These are the kinds of nuanced debates that Mill's work inspires, and they're precisely the kind of critical thinking that the UPSC demands.
It's fascinating how these debates about individual liberty and the role of government are still so relevant today, both within nations and on the global stage.
Exactly. Think about current discussions about data privacy, freedom of speech online, or the responsibility of states to protect their citizens from harm. These are all issues that resonate with Mill's ideas about the limits of government power and the importance of individual autonomy.
And for our UPSC aspirants listening in, this is where you can really shine in your exam. You can demonstrate your understanding of these complex issues by connecting them back to the thinkers who laid the groundwork for these debates.
It's not just about memorizing facts and figures, but about demonstrating critical thinking and the ability to apply these theoretical frameworks to real-world situations.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into John Stuart Mill, what are some of the key takeaways that our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC, should keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, Mill's work provides a powerful defense of individual liberty as a cornerstone of a just and flourishing society. His harm principle, while complex in its application, offers a framework for thinking about the limits of government power and the importance of protecting individual freedom from both state and social coercion.
And we can't forget his distinction between higher and lower pleasures, which challenges us to think about what it truly means for both individuals and societies to thrive. It's not just about maximizing material wealth or power, but about fostering intellectual and moral growth.
Right, and his concept of positive liberty reminds us that freedom is not simply the absence of constraints, but also the ability to develop one's capacities and participate fully in society. This has significant implications for issues like education equality and global development.
So to all our aspiring diplomats and policymakers out there, remember that Mill's ideas are not just abstract theories. They offer valuable insights into the challenges facing our world today.
As you continue your UPSC journey, embrace that spirit of critical thinking and open debate that Mill championed. Engage deeply with these ideas, grapple with their complexities, and consider how they might inform your own approach to international relations.
And don't forget, we've only scratched the surface here. There's a whole world of Mill's writing and scholarship out there waiting to be explored. So keep reading, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive into John Stuart Mill, be sure to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more insightful explorations of the thinkers and ideas that shape our world. We'll be back soon with another episode tackling a new topic that's sure to be on the UPSC radar. Until then, happy studying.